We are living through one of the greatest of scientific endeavors, the attempt to understand the most complex object in the universe, the brain. Scientists are accumulating vast amounts of data about structure and function in a huge array of brains, from the tiniest to our own. Tens of thousands of researchers are devoting massive amounts of time and energy to thinking about what brains do, and astonishing new technology, including computers and artificial intelligence. It's enabling us to both describe and manipulate that activity. Humans can tell computers what to do and how to do by giving the meaning of certain words. Computers can operate as programmed and develop systems and symbols. Computers work by analyzing messages into bytes, and this function is similar to human brains. Both human brains and computers are symbol processors, so computers have potential to bring artificial intelligence.
Globalization is an overused and often misunderstood concept. We hear it all the time on news broadcasts and in any type of public discussion. But the starting point for understanding globalization is that it is industries and markets that globalize, not countries. That's why it's helpful to think of globalization as the integration of economic activities across borders. But why does globalization matter? I would argue globalization matters because it means the rise of interconnectedness between countries and markets across the world. For example, one of the reasons why the financial crash of 2007-2008 was so serious was because the financial and banking systems of countries around the world have become so closely interconnected with the globalization of markets.
Today we'll discuss about abstraction, commonly known as description. There are two methods of description. These are symbolic language and body language. The abstraction is an important part for developing a computer. This is originated from the symbolic system in the computer system. The origin of symbolic system was developed when people try to communicate with each other. The symbolic language took communication to wider people in popularity group. The other part of abstraction is the body language. People accepted body language as well. The physical movement facilitates the development of sign language, which popularly became hand words. There are a number of possible purposes for a social network. You now have a good understanding of how to analyze the basic characteristics of your social network, or that of another individual. Network is a social relationship which helps transfer information, such as traveling from one place to another. It also helps people get to different destinations more quickly if they need to travel a long distance or to destinations. It is suitable for old cities with high-density populations, like Paris. There are thousands of trips and too many travelers every day in Paris. The transportation network in Paris provides thousands of public services and links them together. A good network can help people with long-distance or multi-destination trips. In cities with high-density populations such as Paris, people would be better carefully planning their journeys by looking at the routes of their network in advance to reduce the density of commuters at the same time.
So the pace at which human minds have evolved over the last million years and more recently probably the last 200,000 years has been so frighteningly rapid that, the evolution of cognitive function and perception can only occur in small number of genes. if one needed to adapt dozens of gene changes in concert in order to acquire the penetrating minds that we now have, which our ancestors 5,000 years ago didn't have, the evolution could not have taken place. It really couldn't have occurred so quickly. And so for that reason alone, one begins to really suspect that, the genetic differences between people who say lived 5,000 years ago is evidence that the difference between their cognitive functions and ours is not actually as large. Therefore, a rather small number of genes may be responsible for the powerful minds that humans have, which most of us now possess.
France, one thought, that they were quote-unquote retarded, a word that was used, unfortunately, at that time, and then one tried to see why not. Now, that analysis has been really rejected greatly over the past years because Industrial Revolution is measured by more than simply large factories with industrial workers and the number of machines. And the more, and this is the point of the beginning of this, the more that we look at the Industrial Revolution, the more that we see that the Industrial Revolution was first and foremost an intensification of forms of production, of kinds of production that were already there. And thus we spend more time looking at the intensification of artisanal production, craft production, of domestic industry, which we've already mentioned, that is people, mostly women, but also men and children too, working in the countryside, and that industrial, the rapid rise of industrial production was very much tied to traditional forms of production. In Paris, for example, in 1871 or in 1870, only the average unit of production had only slightly more than 7 people in it. So if you only look for big factories and lots of machines, you'll be missing the boat on the Industrial Revolution.
The history of software is, of course, very, very new. The whole IT industry is really only 67 years old, which is extraordinary. To be so close to the birth of a major new technology, a major new discipline, is quite remarkable given where we've got to in those 67 years. And the progression has been not so much a progression as a stampede, because Moore's law, the rapid expansion in the power of computing and the rapid fall of the cost of computing and storage and communications, has made it feasible for information technology to move into all sorts of areas of life that were never originally envisaged. What has happened is that there has been, as I said, a stampede for people to pick the low-hanging fruit. And that is what's guided the development of software and information technology over the past decades, and continues to do so, with a number of consequences that we will explore.
Design of buildings is important according to architectural textbooks. At its roots, architecture exists to create the physical environment in which people live. But architecture is more than just the built environment. It's also part of our culture. It stands as a representation of how we see ourselves, as well as how we see the world. There are poorly designed buildings, but also some great building works. In the Victoria area, architects designed buildings based on bricks and other materials. The design of flaws was based on lighting, as it would not only affect appearance but also health conditions. The materials that buildings are made of also matter. For example, the design of ground floors must ensure that the building is able to withstand the weight of the higher levels. In the 20th century, many old buildings with design flaws were demolished or modified through a natural selection process, which means they are an altered state rather than an original state. This is an application of Darwin's theory of natural selection to modification of old buildings, which means buildings should adapt to the new world to survive or be pulled down. So, it's argued to be unfair to criticize the demolition, although some people believe that whether to be remain should be decided based on their nature and functions. As the world became more and more connected, the styles evolved. But even in modern construction, there is still an importance in honoring the cultural nuances in the built environment. Internet was invented by people who were good at programming, and people kept optimizing it for different purposes. So Internet has been growing organically. Internet can achieve many things, but has advantages and disadvantages. The email system was designed by graduate students and researchers who know and trust each other. Using email needs trust between the senders and receivers, as the authentication process was not originally built into the system. Email authentication is a technical solution to proving that an email is not forged. In other words, it provides a way to verify that an email comes from who it claims to be from. Email authentication is most often used to block harmful or fraudulent uses of email, such as phishing and spam. In practice, we use the term email authentication to refer to technical standards that make this verification possible. Initially, the email system didn't consider security because there was no suspicion between them at that time, and there was no authentication process built into this system.
Organization studies seem to draw on the whole family of social sciences, clearly psychology, clearly sociology, but also economics, anthropology, politics, as we said, philosophy to a degree, history, sometimes literary studies, cultural studies, so on and so forth. I think that's absolutely right. And for me, that's absolutely the pleasure, and even on good days, the joy of doing organization studies, because it enables you, not just enables, but requires you in some sense, to have some kind of broad familiarization of that sort. Now, there's a price to be paid for that, because that kind of breadth, if you like, does come, I suppose, as the cost of depth. And I guess there would be people who are clearly within academic disciplines or sociology or economics or whatever, who might say, well, these are sort of magpie-shish, amateurish kind of forays into our territory. You know, I wouldn't necessarily disown that idea. But I think that what studying organizations teaches us and teaches me is actually the artificiality of those academic subdivisions. And as soon as we start to actually think about something like the organized world, then immediately, the kinds of things that come into focus are things have traditionally been studied by different demands. And so, I think it's a liberating idea, the idea that we don't need to be bound by those strictures and structures of disciplinary division, and that we can be free actually to imagine and think about the social world through an agglomeration of techniques and ideas and theories and concepts from across the social sciences.
In my view, it's impossible not to talk about wildlife and not think about its role in livelihoods. And I guess part of that is my own view, part of the research that I do in Africa, in most East and West Africa. I look at the role all humans rely on wildlife as a source of food and also the source of income. And we talk about our wildlife, if we talk about fish, we are talking about what is probably the single most important source of protein for humans across the globe. And so billions or more than a billion people rely on fish as their primary source of animal protein, and most of these people live in poverty. So the management of wild fish resources, in a sense, is incredibly important to livelihoods and health. And also, wildlife tourism is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And in many places, such as Africa and South America, it can be the number one source of income. It can be the number one source of foreign income for economies.
The evolution of the washing machine, as demonstrated in this barn, is a representative example of this changing domestic life. For many centuries, sailors used to place their clothing in a cloth bag, tie the bag to a rope, and throw it overboard, letting the ship drag it for hours. The principle was simple: force water through the clothes to remove the dirt. But in the household before running water and electricity, washing clothes took a staggering amount of labor. To wash, boil, and rinse a single load of clothes could take 50 gallons of water, which had to be hand-carried from a pump or well. Hand-wringing, rubbing, and lifting the clothes could expose women to caustic substances in the soaps. The whole process for a household's laundry could take an entire day or more of back-breaking labor. In 1846, a patented washing machine imitated the human hand moving cloth over a washboard by using a lever to rub the clothes between two ribbed surfaces. This machine was sold in the U.S. as late as 1927. The first electric clothes washers, in which a motor rotated the tub, were introduced into America about 1900.
Transportation officials, advocates, companies, and users around the world are talking about how automated vehicles will change transportation as we know it. Autonomous vehicles are split into 6 levels of automation, as defined by the Society of Automotive Engineers. 0, no automation. 1, driver assistance. 2, partial automation. 3, conditional automation. 4, high automation. And 5, full automation. Humans are responsible for motoring the vehicle and performing most functions in levels 1 and 2, while an automated driving system performs all functions in levels 3, 4, and 5. Vehicles in levels 3 and up are considered highly automated vehicles. As vehicles progress to higher levels of automation, less responsibility is put on the driver for monitoring the vehicle. Here's how an automated vehicle works. Several systems work in conjunction with each other to control an automated vehicle. Radar sensors dotted around the car monitor the position of vehicles nearby. Video cameras detect traffic lights, read road signs, and keep track of other vehicles, while also looking out for pedestrians and other obstacles.
Look, I'm going to talk today really mostly about what I do as a curator here at the National Museum, but I want to try and draw some kind of generalities from that in terms of how there's a series of curatorial practices, if you like, tools and techniques and methods that I think could be of interest to your students and of interest to you in developing extension history courses. I want to talk about what I do as a curator, and then from that also talk a little bit about the kinds of history that I think museums are particularly good at creating and communicating. I think this is something I'd really like to discuss because I think it's not necessarily very well understood that museums, as Dave insisted by putting up my quote at the beginning of in his slide, is that I think museums create a very particular kind of history. It's not the kind of history that gets created in books or indeed in films or in, compositions. It's a very particular kind of history that grows out of the fact that museums are centrally interested and defined by their collections. I should say that's not an uncontested view of museums, but it's certainly my view of museums. So curators try to understand material culture as evidence of other people's lives, as a means to try to understand other people, what they looked like, what they did, how they made a living, what they hoped for in their lives, how they tried to construct their world, and why they made particular choices. And one way in which curators differ from other historians is therefore in focus in terms of how we interrogate the past, what elements we use to communicate the past. Most academic historians are trained very much in the discipline of words, and they concentrate on words. Still today, I think, although it's changing a little bit. If you go through university history, I think primarily you are encouraged to draw on things like archival accounts, manuscripts, now oral histories, and most of that work is actually promulgated in the form of books. There's also other kinds of historians, obviously filmmakers and photographers concentrate on creating images of the world and arranging them in meaningful sequences, but curators attend to objects. We look at objects as evidence of the past and try to arrange objects in meaningful ways called exhibitions.
What is a happy home for dogs? That is a broad question, and the answer depends on individuals. However, there are some criteria. It should satisfy dogs' basic needs, not only food, water, and comfort, but also control. It is not to say that dogs try to control owners, but that they can control outcomes for themselves, which means they can get food and beds at any time, because dogs are concerned about issues like, can I get a nice bed and sleeping area when I need it? For them, communication is also important, especially interactive stimulation, because dogs are social animals just like humans. But people do not provide enough for animals yet. We spend 8 hours working every day and often leave them alone at home. So the needs of us and those of dogs are often little matched simultaneously. And a luxury pet house is not enough to be a happy home for dogs. It turns out consumers are incredibly smart. They combine a lifetime of experience with that brand, combined with whatever its designed appeal is, however it makes them feel, performance, and price. And they do all that in a few seconds. So brands are essential to our business to allow us to deliver the increased consumer value associated with our products. We're not into the generic business of toilet paper. We're into probably about the softest product you're going to want to buy. We're not into a generic soap. We're into the best, stain-removing laundry detergent you're going to buy. But we're going to want you to remember that as the Tide brand. Now, that means there's a second moment of truth. If they do select you and they pay 50% more than they would have paid for Walmart's brand, when they get home, it'd be better perform when it's used. And here's where the science starts, folks. There's an amazing number of fundamental engineering contradictions, right? Airplanes deal with it, weight and strength. I want something that's light but strong. That's an engineering contradiction. Once I deal with our things, got to be strong but soft. They have to be strong even when they're wet. Bright but not tear. Liquids, mixtures, not common things, but they need. They can't separate. You don't want to shake before use, before you're poured down your washing machine. The Internet, the most powerful tool in terms of engineering made by humans, has the most complicated structure. What we call the Internet is made up of a lot of things: wires traversing the ocean, satellites and cell phone towers, massive data centers sending packets of information all over, and devices. The Internet can be connected via a modem or an ADSL switch center to a local landline telephone exchange network. It could connect us from Sydney to Melbourne and then to the U.S. However, it takes energy for the transmission system to transmit information. For example, the longer email you write, the more energy is consumed. Meanwhile, there are more than 30 billion things connected to the Internet, like cell phones, laptops, credit card readers, smart TV, and so on, and each of them requires electricity. In total, Internet-connected devices probably use around 5% of the world's electricity. And most of the electricity comes from burning fossil fuels, which release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
So, various conclusions. Yes, bees are in decline. These declines are well documented, they are real, and supported by good, strong scientific evidence, which is the only evidence that counts. The drivers of decline are many and varied depending on the species. The effects of pollinator loss could be absolutely huge. So is it a catastrophe? Not yet. But it could be. On the positive side, we are aware of the problem, awareness is being raised all the time, and people are taking action. That won't fix anything if you recognise a problem. That, at least, is being done.
Well, it's like, why isn't Australian housing so expensive? Essentially, it's showing how well the Australian economy has been doing over the last 15 years. We have had 15 years, more or less, of an uninterrupted economic growth, during which average earning has been raised by close to 90%. Well, over the course of that period, the standard variable mortgage rate has roughly halved. That meant the amount which a typical home-buying household can afford to borrow under rules which aren't strictly applied as they used to be. Over the same period, rising immigration and falling average household size has meant the number of households looking for accommodation has risen by about 1.5 million. That's around 200,000 more than the number of dwellings has increased by. So you've had a substantial increase in the purchasing power of households. No net increase in the supply of housing, and hence all the additional purchasing power has gone into pushing up the price of housing. Well, the 90s came around and finally it clicked that normal people could get online, which hadn't really clicked before. And the little trick that finally put it together was Tim Berners-Lee HTML. So thank you to the UK for providing the fellow who finally put the missing chink in place. And then what happened in the 90s was this extraordinary outpouring of creativity and constructiveness from millions and millions of people. There were millions of people making web pages, creating content online, creating social experiments, creating lessons, all sorts of things. And the first decade of the web took place without much of a profit motive, without any particular charismatic figures driving it, without fear, without a desire for an afterlife or other religious gambits, without advertising, and without any of the traditional motivational schemes. It simply happened because people enjoyed it, and it was a good idea. So the topic for today is abstraction. And this is a very important layer of computer because you can't do anything with a computer unless you have a symbolic system in place, right? So we're talking about the origin of symbolic systems. Language is a classic symbolic system. Apparently one theory for why language evolved is that people communicated with sign language and with movement quite well for a long time. And it turned out they wanted to communicate even while they were doing things. So, while they were trying to strangle the dinosaur, not the dinosaurs, the rhinoceros, they wanted to say, "Come help me." And they used sign language to do it. They had to let go of the rhinoceros, and the rhinoceros ran away. So you can see that it's a good idea to be able to do something with your hands and be able to communicate at the same time. Hence, there comes words and language. Since the discovery of DNA structure, people have believed that genes have an impact only on people's physical structure. However, the study of mapping of genes in 2001 found that there is a genetic responsibility to humans' physical and psychological behaviors, which has changed the way we understand our behaviors. Findings from behavioral genetic research have broadly impacted modern understanding of the role of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. The research on genes has provided integrating information, and the findings can benefit biologists, psychologists, and neuroscientists. Qualitative research has fostered arguments that behavioral genetics is an ungovernable field without scientific norms or consensus, which fosters controversy.
English, as you've already read, is not a pure language. I don't think there really are any pure languages in the world, but English is definitely not a pure language. English, in fact, has borrowed from over 350 languages in its history. So it's a variety of many languages. Some people say it's like a dog, a mongrel dog, a dog that's been made up of many different dogs. The English language is like that. And by looking at the history of the English language, we learn about the history of the English people. The two things are closely connected. So in fact, today we're not only learning about language, but we're learning about history. And the fact that English has borrowed words from over 350 languages has been viewed differently throughout history. So for example, in Shakespeare's time, people were very angry about words which were not, they thought, original English words, words which came from other languages. They didn't like them.
Today, more and more people realize that the global economic and financial crisis also concerns common ethical values and standards. I am pretty concerned that the global economy has become unethical and unfair. Recent experiences have proved that the sustainability of the market economy is by no means guaranteed. Indeed, one cannot escape the fact that the emergence of global capitalism has brought with it an entirely new set of risks. The global economic and financial crisis concerns common ethical standards. For example, the trade between Europe and the United States has been unfair, which needs to be further negotiated. These problems of the global economy should be on the agenda for the following years. Obviously, all ethical values and standards are culture-bound, but there are core values and standards that are universal. I strongly believe that in the long run, the global market economy will only be accepted in different regions and nations if it is socially acceptable.